So before we start today, let me give you a bit of background as to where I'm coming from with this thing called faith. Because I think a lot of people assume that I grew up in it, which actually isn't the case at all. I came to it much later. I wasn't raised as a Christian. I wasn't raised in the church. I think despite that, I always had this feeling that there was probably a God. You know, I look at the world, I see sophisticated and complex design, I see intelligent design, and I thought, well, that makes sense to me there's an intelligent designer. So that wasn't really a sticking point, but the major sticking point for me was organized religion. That was always a stumbling block for me. And, you know, I think I always had this idea that religion was just a list of fun stuff you couldn't do and a list of boring stuff that you had to do. And I want to say to you today, as someone who has now been a Christian for 10 years, I still think that. Right? I still think that. I still think religion is boring. I still think it's useless. I still think it's irrelevant. And you might say, well, that kind of sounds like the ultimate paradox. Well, I kind of thought that once as well. But what I've come to understand over the past 10 years is that Jesus and religion really don't have very much in common. And I hope as we explore this passage today, you're going to start to see a little bit more of what I'm talking about. The context for the passage we're going to look at today is that Jesus is hanging on a cross next to these two criminals who have also been sentenced to death through crucifixion. And Jesus has been scourged, beaten, degraded, and abused. And he's hanging on this cross, and either side of him are these two criminals who have also been sentenced to die. And we're going to have a look today at this little conversation that happens between Jesus and these two men. And in this conversation, we see one of these men is really hostile towards Jesus, and the other one has quite a different reaction to him. So let me read you the passage. It starts, Luke 23:32. Two other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. He said, "Don't you fear God, since you're under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we're getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And in the time that I have available with you, I want to look at verses 39 to 43 in particular. These verses kick off with this hostile man who speaks up and he says, "Aren't you the Messiah?" He's saying, "Aren't you the one they've been talking about? That can heal, that can save, that's supposed to be from God? Why don't you prove it then? Now's a good time to show us what you got, Jesus. Why don't you get yourself down from this cross? And hey, while you're at it, why don't you help me get down too?" And Jesus doesn't respond to this man. I guess he knows he doesn't actually believe. But then there's this criminal on the other side of Jesus, and he speaks up in reply to this man, and he says, "Don't you fear God, since you're under the same sentence?" He's saying, "Mate, have you forgotten where you are right now? Have you forgotten that you are hanging on a cross as well? Has it somehow slipped your mind that we've seen our last sunrise? Yet you still don't fear God. He says, you're about to be judged by a holy God. Now is not the time to bury your head in the sand. Now is not the time for sarcasm or pretending that your sins don't matter." He says, we're getting what we deserve, but this man, this Jesus, he's done nothing wrong. It's like the guy's had a last minute epiphany and he's done the math on a situation and he's realized four important things. Number one, he's going to die. Number two, when he does, he's going to face judgment. Number three, the judge is a holy God. And number 4, he's not holy. He's realized this key and really central idea that God is holy and he's not holy. In fact, he's realized he's a long way short of holy, and unless God can forgive him, show him some mercy and some grace, well, this judgment thing, it's not going to go well for him. And in our culture, I think we sometimes struggle with the idea of judgment. We think, if God is supposed to be loving, so if he does exist, he'll probably just forgive everyone, everything, right? But I want to encourage us to flip that idea on its head and see it completely the other way around, because ultimately, if God is holy, how could he not judge the world? I want to put forth the idea that if God doesn't judge, then he's not interested in bringing about justice. And if he's not interested in bringing about justice, well then I think he fails to be a loving God. A loving God cannot look evil in the face and say, you carry on unchecked for all eternity. Now, a loving and holy God must deal with evil and put it to death once and for all, and that is exactly what the judgment is. And the guy on the cross has realized that if God is going to put all that's unholy to death, well then that's going to include him, because he's not holy. And he's right. But I think there's a danger with this, that we look at this kind of story, we look at that man and we say, what a rotten guy. I'm glad he's getting what he deserves. And the danger is that we fail to see ourselves in this man. We fail to acknowledge that we're unholy too. Because the reality is that, we live with selfishness and anger and greed and self-righteousness and pride and a lack of self-control day in, day out that renders us unholy. The truth is we're not so different from this man. Sure, he's up on the cross and his sins are on display for all to see. But just because our sins are a little less obvious, it doesn't make them less serious. Selfishness, anger, greed, self-righteousness, pride, and lack of self-control, we all experience. Those sins drive as much of a wedge between us and God as this man's sins did between him and God. But I love what happens next. The criminal says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And I think this is amazing because he's coming with such a contrite and sincere heart. He's not coming with a self-righteous attitude saying, you need to forgive me or I deserve a second chance. No, he's coming in total brokenness before God. I don't think he's even got the nerve or the pride to say, God, will you forgive me? I don't think he's got the nerve or the pride to say, God, will you save me? He says, Jesus, will you remember me? Jesus answers him, today you will be with me in paradise. And that is a display of amazing grace, by the way. I think in the church sometimes we band the words mercy and grace around as though they're the same thing, but they're not. Grace is like mercy on steroids. If Jesus had just been merciful in this moment, and the man says, will you remember me? Jesus would have said, yeah, I remember you. But he wasn't merciful in that moment, he was gracious. The man says, will you remember me? Jesus says, I'll do you something much better than that. Today, you will be with me. That's grace. That's amazing grace. And I love this so much because it's the beauty and the simplicity of the Christian faith in a nutshell. You see, on the one hand, the Christian faith is so deep and complex and sophisticated that you could study it for a lifetime and you wouldn't have gotten close to uncovering the deep mysteries of God. Yet on the other hand, God has revealed to us a gospel message that is so simple that everyone can access, understand, and respond to it. You see, this man, he doesn't have time to deal in religion. He doesn't have time for that. It's too late. He doesn't have time to do all the things that religious types think you have to do to be right with God. He doesn't have time to memorize scriptures or tithe 10%. He doesn't have time to tell all his friends or invite someone to a church service. He doesn't have time to take Holy Communion or get all his theology perfectly aligned and read up on church history. He doesn't have time, capacity, or opportunity for any of that because he's dying and he's desperate. He doesn't have time to do anything. But here's the beautiful truth of the gospel. It's not about what you do. It's about Jesus and what he's done for you. And all this man has time to do is put his faith and trust in Jesus. And here's the wonderful thing. It's enough. It's enough. Faith is enough because Jesus is enough. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus says, today you will be with me. You know, one of the things that infuriates me most is when I see religion stand in the way of God. One of the things that keeps me awake at night and that I hate most in the world is when religion hides the true, amazing and unfailing love of God. And one of the things I tell people over and over again, not because I particularly enjoy repeating myself, but because I meet so many people who don't understand this simple truth, is that Jesus and religion are so different. Jesus actually says this in Luke 11:46 when confronting some religious leaders. He says, "What sorrow awaits you experts of religious law? For you crush people with unbearable religious demands, and you never lift a finger to ease their burden." Elsewhere in the scriptures, he calls religious people whitewashed tombs. You know what a whitewashed tomb is? Basically, it's a grave. It looks good on the outside, but on the inside, there's death. So what's the difference, you might ask, between faith and religion? Well, religion will tell you, work your way towards being a holy person. It will tell you, wear this piece of clothing, pray this amount of times per day, face this particular direction as you pray, avoid this certain type of food. It places all the responsibility of holiness on you by keeping the rules. And it's quite literally a burden you cannot bear. But the reality of the Christian faith, the thing that separates Christianity from every other worldview on the planet, is that with Christianity you don't have to work to achieve salvation. You don't have to work to earn holiness because Jesus has done it all already. All you need to do is put your faith and trust in him, and that is not a work. Jesus has achieved everything that was necessary for your salvation. He has paid the price of your sin in full through his death on the cross. All we need to do is put our faith and trust in him. You see, Christianity is not the way of religious people. It's the way of faith, and it's open to all. And this criminal on the cross, he's come to the end of his rope. Clock's run down on his life. And in his mind, by his standards, he's got nothing left to offer Jesus. So he simply offers him his broken heart and says, "Jesus, would you remember me?" And the amazing thing is that at that point where this man only has his heart left to offer, we come to understand that that was the only thing God wanted from him in the first place. Of the two men on the cross beside Jesus, we see two totally different reactions to Jesus. One man's reaction is full of pride, and he says to Jesus, "Prove that you're God, and if you can't, I'm going my own way." The second man humbles himself, saying, "God, I'm a sinner over here and I need your help." And that is the Christian life, isn't it? It's not about a prideful boast. It's not about a self-righteous attitude that says, "God, I deserve to know you because I'm so good and I'm so holy." No, it's about a humble heart of sincerity that says, "God, I'm a sinful person over here. Please, would you have mercy on me?" I don't understand it all, but I understand you're holy, and I understand I'm not. And I need your compassion if you've got anything left for me. And if that's you today, and the cry of your heart is the cry of a broken one, I want you to hear Jesus' words to this man. Today you will be with me. You will be with me.